past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. Opened the earth, rocking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts. Screaming white-hot flames and agony, she challenged millions of headhunters, dragging and ripping apart impossible tender moments of time, shipping vessels of history, ancient history, destroying the fabric, the godlike claw of destiny, of a people, with a gun, a knife, a cannon, building the hideous wall of blood called slavery.
Well, greetings as always. Welcome back, and thanks for joining me. So about 3 weeks ago or so, the Trump administration began an extrajudicial murder campaign off the coast of Venezuela in the Caribbean Sea, blowing up boats without due process, without presenting any wrongdoing or any evidence of wrongdoing, and sending the passengers into the sea to their watery graves. Then U.S.-backed Venezuelan regime change agent Maria Corina Machado wins the Nobel Peace Prize. I started asking then if this award was the committee's green light for regime change in Venezuela. And now she's asking the Trump administration to directly intervene in the politics of the country. What does all this mean? Well, let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into the current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly look at a couple of today's headlines. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who was awarded the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize last week, has called for greater U.S. support to stop what she describes as a war on her country by the democratically elected president, Nicolas Maduro. In an interview with CNN's Christiane Amanpour yesterday, Machado echoed the Trump administration in calling President Maduro a criminal narco-terrorism structure, while asking President Trump for greater help in unseating him from power. U.S. Special Operations helicopters near Venezuela expand Caribbean mission. The elite 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment appears to have flown within 90 miles of Venezuela, according to a post-visual analysis. That's the Washington Post. Trump has authorized CIA covert action inside the country. Final story, how FEMA is forcing disaster-struck towns to fend for themselves. Trump has said he wants to eventually shift the burden of disaster relief and recovery onto the states. Well, it appears as though it's already happening. With that, let's turn to the story, the issue for the day. As my guest writes, the run-up to this year's Nobel Peace Prize had many fearfully expecting Trump to win the award. But in an unexpected twist, the Nobel Committee found an equally undeserving far-right lunatic, Venezuelan fascist opposition leader and number one U.S. lackey, Maria Corina Machado, to give the award. Well, my guest is a writer and editor at Venezuelan Analysis. His articles have appeared on Investigating Action, Monthly Review, Truth Out, Counterpunch, and Venezuelan Analysis. Ricardo Vaz, my brother, welcome.
Hey, Wilmer, it's great to be in touch again. I was just checking before we went on air. We did like 5 years of interviews on the Critical Hour, and so it's great to reconnect. And I mean, we've talked a lot about Machado, and we unfortunately have to do it again.
We've been talking about her and her machinations for a very long time, as well as Juan Guaido. Before we get to her, let's start with, and again, I said it was about 3 weeks, maybe it's been a little bit longer, but Donald Trump started this campaign of extrajudicial murder, blowing up boats in the Caribbean Sea, claiming that they are trafficking in drugs, presenting no evidence, and basically he's murdered. I want to say, is it now? He struck, I think, about six boats and has murdered about 26 or 27 people.
Yeah.
Ricardo.
So the first attack was September 2nd, so it's about 6 weeks now.
Okay.
And yeah, it's hard to keep track because sometimes Trump will just say, "Oh, we hit another boat," and then it's not confirmed. Even the ones that they do show these grainy videos, it's not totally clear. But I mean, I think that's more or less the count: 6 boats and 27 people killed in total. And as you were saying, I mean, there's zero evidence that they were carrying narcotics besides Trump saying, "Oh, you know, there's a lot of cocaine floating in the water," as if that constitutes any evidence. And the other thing that they say is that the boats were headed to the U.S., but they were struck right off the coast of Venezuela. So how can you, I mean, it's not like they had Google Maps and the route to the US and they spotted it from satellites on their phones. So it's speculation, to put it very, very generously, that they were headed to the US. And in fact, I mean, maybe at some point we can discuss these drug allegations a bit more thoroughly, but usually these boats that leave the Venezuelan coast, the ones that are known to carry drugs, which is not established in these cases, they usually go to the Caribbean islands. They do some kind of island hopping, and they mostly go, I mean, the ones that go to the Caribbean go to Europe. So it's not even established that they would head to the US. So it's just I think in another article, I called it Rambo antics in the Caribbean to, distract from whatever needs to be distracted at the moment, whether that's Ukraine or Palestine now is a bit more positive for the administration, or before the Epstein list. So the administration is just recklessly and with impunity up until now murdering civilians on the high seas with no due process. I mean, there are established procedures, right? I mean, the Coast Guard can perfectly intercept these boats, which are unarmed, and it can actually check if they are carrying narcotics. It can prosecute the people on board if that's the case. But the Trump administration has created this very deadly fantasy that there's they are in an international conflict with unspecified drug cartels, and that the poisoning, quote unquote, of American communities constitutes an armed attack, as a very unjustified or unconvincing attempt to justify these murders.
In fact, to your point about unjustified, during this interview on CNN with Christiana Amanpour, she was interviewing Corina Machado, and Christiane made the point. She says, when you look at the FBI drug data, only the FBI says that only about 5% of the cocaine that makes its way into the United States comes from Venezuela. And Machado just dismissed that. Oh, no, well, there's other data. And so to your point, Venezuela is not the source of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just the FBI. I mean, the DEA, I mean, the most unsuspect of sources, the DEA, doesn't mention Venezuela at all in its 2024 report. I mean, the most recent report from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, I think that's what it's called, has a map of routes, and again, it's 5 to 10% of the cocaine transits through Venezuela, and it's a geographical argument. I mean, since it's nearly all produced in Colombia, and the market is the United States, it makes much more sense. It's cheaper to just go through the Pacific and then transit through these Central American countries, where, by the way, the DEA has a very strong presence, before crossing the border by land. I mean, that's been more than established, and it traces back several years. I mean, there are reports on this from the last 10 years, and they all basically coincide. There's an article on Venezuela analysis that I recommend people look up. It's from Pino Arlaki, and Arlaki was the head of this UN agency on drugs and crime for some time, and he says that it's complete fantasy to try and plant these narco-terrorism, quote-unquote, narratives about Venezuela. And the other thing is that the main cause of overdoses in the US is fentanyl. It's not cocaine. Mm-hmm. And fentanyl has even less to do with Venezuela than cocaine. I mean, it flows through Mexico, through the land border. So again, it's just a made-up narrative to further, whatever the U.S. foreign policy goals are in this moment.
In fact, there was about a week or so ago, I can't remember what country it was from. One of the presidents showed this picture of all of these kilos of cocaine stacked. And the problem that I saw with it was how neat and clean these packages were. If these I can't remember which country they were allegedly from, but if they had actually been on a boat that had been struck by a missile from a United States ship, they were perfectly packaged, very clean. It justified logic.
Ricardo. It was the Dominican Republic.
Dominican Republic. Thank you.
So, and I mean, I think it looked like they had the press conference ready. The U.S. ambassador was there on short notice, and yeah, I mean, they say they recovered these, very neat.
Didn't they say it was a ton?
I think it was a ton, and they recovered a third of it, something to that effect. Okay. And it was all very, very neatly and very conveniently presented. But I think one thing that we have to reject is that even if it's the case that they are carrying drugs, and we know that, I mean, there is smuggling in the Caribbean of, drugs, gasoline, weapons, whatever you want to call it, that doesn't carry the death penalty, and certainly doesn't give the US the authority to extrajudicially kill people without legal process. I mean, there are procedures established for fighting narcotics trading, and one of the people who has been more vocal about this has been Colombian President Gustavo Petro, and even exemplifying, this is how the Colombian Coast Guard intercepts boats and whatnot. And the issue, or let's say the bigger issue, is that this now no longer concerns just Venezuela. There were reports, according to some Pentagon officials, that one of the boats, I can't remember if it was the third or the fourth, depending on how we're counting them, actually left from Colombia and carried Colombian nationals. And on the latest strike, which was a couple of days ago, it seems that two of the occupants were from Trinidad. So it has become like a full Caribbean murder spree. And in the case of Colombia, Petro has been very vocal from day one in opposing these kinds of extrajudicial executions. But in Trinidad, it now puts the local government in a problem, because the prime minister, I can't remember her name right now, she has been very enthusiastic in supporting Trump and saying, yes, blow up these boats, we don't care. But now, it's Trinidadian nationals, and, their families are, asking the government for explanations. Here you have Trinidadian citizens executed in international waters with no due process, with no evidence of any wrongdoing. What are you going to do about it? And this comes at the same time as Trinidad is either actively hosting or at least looking the other way when it comes to US military assets in its territory. So it is definitely a very complex and dangerous situation here in the Caribbean.
I think the prime minister in Trinidad is Kamala Persad Bessiere. I think that's her name. So this other allegation of being a drug lord and also in association with Tren de Aragua, how is all of this playing out in Venezuela?
I mean, I'm glad we have a lot of time to dismantle all these narratives. So Tren de Aragua is a province here in Venezuela, and this was a local gang that emerged first from like a crime syndicate associated to a construction project, and it established a headquarters in one of the main prisons here, and it operated from there. And then it kind of embedded in migration, but it was never. I mean, I'm paraphrasing intelligence memos from U.S. intelligence agencies where they say, these petty criminals, follow the flow of migration to different parts of Latin America and eventually to the U.S. And it's in their interest to say, if they want to see more, they want people to fear them, to say that they belong to a very powerful criminal structure. But there is no evidence of Tren de Aragua operating with any kind of centralized command, even more so after the Venezuelan government in late 2023 did a large-scale intervention in this prison where they had the headquarters and kind of dismantled their command and control structure here in Venezuela. So there has never been any evidence of Tren de Aragua operating as any kind of coherent and cohesive structure anywhere in the world, even less so in the US. But then, of course, it's to everyone's benefit to just play up the threat. I mean, local law enforcement will get more funding if it says it's fighting some transnational crime organization. The same with the administration, if it wants to justify this kind of military expansion. But again, going back to even the DEA report, the latest DEA report said something like, Tren de Aragua, there's no evidence of them being involved in drug trafficking beyond, this kind of petty street level distribution, which is what you have from, petty criminals. So again, to say that they are a foreign terrorist organization, that they are coordinating shipments by sea, has no resemblance to reality. And the connections to the Maduro government, again, paraphrasing US intelligence memos, they find no connection whatsoever. I mean, even to the contrary, that it was in the government's interest to dismantle these kinds of criminal structures in Venezuela. So again, it's just a narrative that because Trump is already a serial liar and his people do not contradict him, it just gets repeated over and over. The corporate media is also very pliant, even though it has kind of pushed back a bit on this issue, but not to the effect of actually challenging anything. Then you have this narrative that they try to perpetuate, even if they don't have any backing in actual facts and reality.
So MS-13 they are not.
No, I mean, not by a long shot. And yeah, I mean, sometimes you'll see some a Venezuelan commits a murder in Colombia or in Chile or whatever. Then you'll have everyone say, oh, here's Tren de Aragua striking again. But again, there's no evidence to sustain it.
There was a New York Times story. Venezuela's Maduro offered the U.S. his nation's riches to avoid conflict. Venezuela's autocrat had proposed allocating his country's oil wealth and other natural resources to the U.S. and ending deals with American adversaries to appease President Trump. This is from 6 days ago. Is there any validity to this story?
I mean, the New York Times seems like a conveyor belt for propaganda, and even more actively right now. I mean, you saw this piece yesterday that said, Trump administration authorizes CIA covert operations in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And at first you see it and you understand that it's an escalation, but then you stop and wonder, when was it not authorized mm-hmm. to conduct covert operations in, quote unquote, official enemies? So, I mean, this story about offering resources, I think it has to be taken with a huge grain of salt. This is only coming from anonymous administration sources. But I mean, part of it is on the record. I mean, Maduro has said plenty of times that he's open to, constructive, respect-based dialogue and reestablishing diplomatic relations with the U.S. He has called for foreign investment and in particular for U.S. companies to invest in Venezuela's oil sector and other sectors. So in that sense, there is nothing new in the sense of Venezuela being open to, outside investment. There is this context that we talked about a lot in the critical hour about how sanctions have damaged the economy and how they have forced the Venezuelan government to kind of loosen a bit the role of the state, kind of surrender a bit of sovereignty in a bid to get outside investment, and of course the debate of how much of these concessions are necessary and how much go a bit further. But I mean, in the sense that these business opportunities exist, there's nothing new there. And but then the other part that Maduro offered some kind of fire sale and offered to kick out Russian, Chinese, and Iranian companies. That part is a bit too fanciful to be true. It doesn't make any sense. It just seems like part of the propaganda to kind of delegitimize and make the government seem weaker than it actually is at a time when the U.S. is escalating these threats.
So here's the Times story. Trump administration authorizes covert CIA action in Venezuela. The Trump administration has secretly, so now they're publishing this in the New York Times, but secretly authorized the CIA to conduct covert action in Venezuela, according to U.S. officials stepping up a campaign against Maduro, the country's authoritarian leader. Well, first of all, if the CIA is operating covertly in Venezuela, well, then the drug story then makes more sense, because it would seem as though the CIA is the entity that is dealing in the drug trade, because we know their history. So if that is in fact happening, that's probably a true story. But with that being said, one of the other signals to me that is an indication that I need to question the story is when in the story they refer to Maduro as an authoritarian leader. That says to me that this isn't true journalism, that it's propaganda targeting Maduro.
Yeah, same with the previous story that you mentioned, and already in the teaser they call him an autocrat. So it's already kind of a preemptive justification for, eventual action that we hope not, but, realistically, knowing the history, there could be attempts. I mean, there was an assassination attempt against Maduro in 2018, which with explosive-laden drones that failed, and the Venezuelan government has also denounced other plots in the years since. So, I mean, as you were saying, I mean, this is propaganda in the sense that, if it's secret, it's not gonna appear on the New York Times. So this is the U.S. government sending a message through the New York Times. And actually, funny, I mean, not funny, but also tragic story about CIA and drugs. The other cartel or imaginary cartel that's in the official narrative is Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns. And actually, the origin of the Cartel of the Suns is from the 1980s and 90s, when there were U.S.-friendly governments here in Venezuela, and the CIA conspired to smuggle drugs out of the country. And Venezuelan officials often say, and I think they're right, that the biggest cartel is the DEA. And I mean, we could spend the rest of the hour just recalling the examples of how drug trafficking has been weaponized by the U.S. government, both at home and abroad, to just further its interests and attack its enemies. So again, I think it was one of our regular authors, Roger Harris, that said that the drug allegations are more like a mirror for the U.S.
The drug allegations are more like a mirror. Emily Schroeder says, I doubt the CIA is operating in Venezuela. And to that point, I think there is some validity to her point, because we know that to a great degree, the CIA got out of directly being involved in regime change operations and turned that over to the National Endowment for Democracy. So they may not be the CIA, but they are CIA offshoots and operatives by other names, such as the National Endowment for Democracy. Ricardo.
Actually, the National Endowment for Democracy allows us to circle back to Maria Corina Machado. And I'm writing a piece for FAIR on how the corporate media covered, the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, I can't even say that with a straight face. And they start the story when Machado founded a vote or an electoral transparency NGO called Sumate, and that has two major problems. One is that she actually started a few months before, when she participated in the 2002 coup that briefly unseated the Chavez government. That's one of the problems, that none of the media seems to want to remember that as part of her quote-unquote peace trajectory. And the other problem is that Sumate was funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. What you were saying, that the CIA stopped being so directly involved in regime change and switched to these other more, let's call it soft power, even though it's not always soft power methods of trying to unseat these unfriendly governments. So all these agencies, USAID, although it kind of had this circus stories with the Trump administration in the beginning. I mean, at some point, the borders, or where one agency stops and where the other agency begins, or even the FBI. I mean, there's a lot of potential for covert activities here in Venezuela, and when they do happen, it's not going to be leaked. Or if they do happen, it's not going to be leaked in the New York Times or any other of the legacy media. It's so in this case, it's really more of trying to continue to threaten the Maduro government. The hope for the U.S. and maybe here we can just take a step back to the big picture. When Machado calls for a foreign intervention, and I mean, wanting to be taken to the presidential palace atop a U.S. helicopter, I imagine that's her end game or her fantasy. Right now, there aren't enough assets. I mean, most analysts agree that there aren't enough assets to conduct any kind of ground invasion. It would be unthinkable to try and do that. But there's still a lot of potential for destruction. There's a lot of heavy weaponry in these boats, so they may try to bomb from afar, maybe try and hit some strategic targets. But the hope for the Trump administration, which has been their hope for a long time, is that they'll get a coup like in the 1950s and 60s, that the military is just going to turn on the government, stage a coup and take power. That would be the cleanest, let's say, way for the U.S. plans to come to fruition. But we've seen this story for years now. Remember when we were talking about Guaido, and Guaido would always tweet at the armed forces, now is the time for you to take responsibility and whatever. I mean, it doesn't look like it's going to happen. The military have been very firm in defending the country's sovereignty. So it doesn't look like these threats, I mean, of course, they're very dangerous and they're part of a kind of psychological war operation, but it doesn't look like they're going to fulfill this effect of generating a collapse from the inside.
It doesn't look like they're going to generate collapse from the inside. Kevin Baptiste, thank you very much for that $10 super sticker. Ricardo, could you speak to Machado's involvement in coups against Chavez back in the day and how her past actions have resulted in the deaths of her countrymen?
Yes, that's a very good question and very relevant right now. So Machado is from not one, but two of the Venezuelan oligarchic families that have held massive wealth and land dating back to independence. And so these people thought that the country was destined for them to rule in the future. And so when Chavez, who comes from the Llanos here and he's not white and he's very humble and so on, I mean, it feels like an insult to them, like their country was taken away. And so Machado, very much in that vein, was part of this 2002 coup that unseated Chavez didn't last 48 hours. And the most damning part is that there was a decree. So as soon as these elites, these deluded elites, managed to get to the presidential palace after parts of the military arrested Chavez and so on, there was a decree that in one fell swoop, derogated the Constitution and dissolved all the elected institutions, the National Assembly and so on. And it installed a transition government, so a de facto dictatorship. And many people, political leaders signed this decree, including Machado. And then Machado came later saying, I thought this was just an attendance registry. I didn't know what I was signing, as if that's supposed to convince anyone. So that was her political debut. Then she had all this idea of creating an NGO with US funding. And with all that money, they tried a recall referendum against Chavez in 2004. And this was the beginning of a pattern that we would see many times in the future. So Chavez won this referendum quite handily. I think it was 59-41 in the end. But this NGO, Sumate, had some very dubious, let's call them, exit polls that said that Chavez had lost by the opposite margin, 41-59. And so they made these baseless fraud allegations, didn't attempt to scrutinize any of the vote. And it was the beginning of this pattern of claiming fraud without any evidence whenever an election goes against them. Then Machado kind of went through like most of the opposition, went through a bit of a hiatus when Chavez, the Bolivarian government really went on the offensive and proclaimed the socialist path and so on. And then she comes back in 2010 as a National Assembly deputy. But her penchant for taking power by undemocratic, unpeaceful means always gets the better of her. And so in 2014, after Chavez had passed, Machado and some other far-right leaders, Leopoldo Lopez, I think we also discussed him at some point in the show, they had an opening and they declared La Salida, the exit, which was this series of violent street protests that in the end left some 40-something people dead. But it's called the exit. It's not like they are just protesting for human rights or whatever. So she has had this trajectory of wanting to take power by whatever means she can get the hand of. And then in 2017 there was another edition of these street protests. She wasn't directly involved, but she also endorsed them, and she also endorsed the Guaido parallel government that we had a lot of fun with. And then she was criticizing the Guaido government for not, activating some international treaty to call for a foreign intervention. This really warrants mentioning. When we talk about peace, right now, the biggest threat to peace, I mean, of course, the US, but there's no avoiding the genocide in Palestine. And so when you see someone get the Nobel Peace Prize, it's quite a legitimate question to ask, what has he said about Palestine?
Mhm.
And not only has she said absolutely nothing concerning the plight of the victims of genocide, she is on the record supporting Israel, even during the genocide. I mean, in January of this year, she tweeted something about, I just had a very productive conversation with the Israeli foreign minister, and I thanked him for his support for the Venezuelan cause. So she thanked an Israeli official for taking a break from, genocidal daily activities to support her own cause. And in 2018, she wrote a letter to Netanyahu asking him to lead a foreign coalition to intervene in Venezuela. She has reiterated messages saying that Israel is a beacon of Western values and this kind of thing. So at a time where perhaps there's no bigger litmus test than where do you stand on Palestine, the Nobel Peace Prize goes to someone who is a very full-fledged Zionist.
So in very realpolitik practical terms, how powerful is she right now? Or is she more of a figment of the imagination of the West and a creation of Western media? And is she even in the country right now?
I mean, the official version, or her official version, is that she's in the country in hiding. That's been the version for a few months now. I mean, Machado was always a marginal figure, even when she launched the exit protest in 2014. I mean, she was just off having a very marginal vote in the opposition primaries for the previous year's presidential elections. But as time went on, she kind of benefited from the infighting and the splits within the opposition and the kind of loss of credibility from other leaders like Guaido. And because she was always harping on the same chord, she was always saying, we need a foreign intervention to overthrow the government. We need a foreign intervention to overthrow the government. Whereas, other opposition leaders try different things and fail. So at some point, kind of by default, she gathers some popularity because of that. But at the same time, she has failed in her promises to take power. She does, I reckon she does have some support in the country, but not support where, she wins the Nobel Peace Prize and people are going out on the streets to celebrate or protest or what have you. I mean, right now, the only way she gets to the presidential palace is, quite literally, is atop a U.S. helicopter after, unspeakable death and destruction to remove the government and the armed forces. She's also been quite frequently on the record saying, the armed forces, your duty, it's time to get rid of the government, but it has mostly fallen on deaf ears until now.
She reminds me in some regards to the late Alexei Navalny in Russia, in that he was marginal at best. In talking to people who were tracking Russian elections, he didn't even have 2% following in the country. But the West locked onto him and then characterized him or mischaracterized him as this opposition leader who was threatening the established government. And so I see Machado in many regards, again, as a fiction of the West, and I mean that in terms of power, and a tool of the West, not anybody that is really wielding any kind of true threat on their own, and is more of an annoyance in the country than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, she's clearly an agent of U.S. imperialism, and while her political career is very dubious and mediocre, she hasn't spared any effort when it comes to building relations in Washington, D.C., both with Democrats and Republicans. I mean, she's been a friend of Marco Rubio for a long time. In 2005, this was also one of her prominent moments of early fame. She was invited to the White House by then President George W. Bush as some recognition for whatever, trying to overthrow a democratically elected government that Bush didn't like. So she does have a lot of support in Washington D.C. and also because of what she has in mind for the country if she eventually takes power. I mean, there are many examples of this, but there was a podcast with Donald Trump Jr. where she's just saying, Venezuela can be a paradise for U.S. corporations. We're going to privatize everything. We're going to kick out the state from the oil sector, and there will be infinite riches for everyone. So it's not hard to understand why it's in it's in the interests of the U.S. if Machado or someone like her was eventually to take power. And actually, the Washington Post, in one of these editorials after the Nobel Peace Prize, kind of said the quiet part out loud. I mean, they said that Machado, I think they kind of recognized that her methods to take power have not always been peaceful and democratic, but that the U.S. interests would be better served if someone like her was in power.
Let's switch gears and go over to Argentina, because it's been reported by a number of sources that the U.S., this is today, is working on doubling aid to Argentina to $40 billion, but Trump is only offering this if Argentina reelects Milei. So this is basically a bribe that Donald Trump is offering to the Argentinian population or the Argentinian electorate, but the immediate response within Argentina seems to be having the opposite effect. Your thoughts? What's going on, Ricardo?
Yeah, I mean, the Milei is a buffoon, a dangerous buffoon, but a buffoon nonetheless. And it seems like his aides did not explain to Trump what's going to happen in November. He's not running for re-election. These are legislative midterm elections, and he has a party that was very marginal, and then he kind of leapt to the presidency, and so now it remains to be seen whether they can get a decent foothold in the legislative chamber or in both legislative chambers. But it's not like he's going to win or lose. He's going to continue being the president, and it looked like the Trump administration didn't fully understand this part. But it actually gets worse. There was a video of the Argentinian delegation and the U.S. delegation, and Milei talks for 20 minutes, and Trump is staring at him. And then when he finishes speaking, Trump says, "Can we get interpretation? Is it possible?" So he didn't pay attention. He didn't understand a single word that Milei was saying. And then they were saying, "Should I say it again?" And Trump, "Don't worry about it. Who cares?" So basically, I mean, these are kind of Trump lookalikes that follow the same playbook, but it just ends up in disaster. I mean, everything that Milei promised, that he was going to recover the economy, he was going to finish, he was going to get inflation under control. It has all gone awry, and he has made these inhuman cuts to the public administration, closing agencies, privatizing everything. Poverty is on the rise. It's been consistently on the rise in Argentina. There's a lot of discontent. And so now he can't even get his finances under control. And he has to, even though he's one of these people who say, zero deficit and having everything fiscal control and so on. And then he has to run to the US with his hands out asking for money. And it's not like he's not going to get another loan. It seems more like a swap agreement, like a currency swap agreement to stabilize the Argentinian currency, because also there's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of people making easy money on the currency market. So this is just kind of a libertarian experiment on steroids, neoliberalism unleashed, that is just imposing unlimited suffering on the population. And of course, it's in the US's interest to push it forward as much as it can.
You mentioned Milei is more like a Trump double or stand-in. Are there any comparisons to draw, since the show is called Connecting the Dots? Are there any dots to connect between Milei and Jair Bolsonaro, who was the former president in Brazil?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are all part of this new right-wing or even far-right current that has been growing in Latin America. And another example is Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, who, by the way, I mean, Ecuador is submerged into a crisis of violence and drug trafficking. Because there's so much instability, it becomes much more convenient, since Ecuador is on the Pacific, to move drugs through Ecuador. And I mean, there's documented stories of Noboa. I mean, I'm sorry for the little geographical detour, but Noboa is from a very wealthy family that built its fortune exporting bananas. And there are stories of the banana containers.
Right, having been used for drugs.
Yeah, so it's bananas with an extra of cocaine. So these are the kinds of figures.
Banana.
Yeah, banana plus.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, with Bolsonaro, I mean, Bolsonaro is slightly different because he comes from the military, and so he's one of these people who come from honor the military dictatorship tradition in Brazil. Milei praises the dictatorship in Argentina, but does not have kind of a similar direct connection. But in ideological terms,
and that's what I meant.
They are very similar. And I can't believe I'm gonna say this, because Bolsonaro was a fool. I mean, he made these scenes where he appeared with the gun and all of this, but somehow he looks respectable. I mean, maybe memory is betraying you, but Milei is actually much worse. I mean, he goes on stage and he tries to sing and he sounds horrible. So people were saying, after Machado won the Nobel Peace Prize, maybe give a Grammy to Milei. Why not?
So, again, getting back to Venezuela and the real on-the-ground implications of this, understanding the people's militia in Venezuela. I say to folks all the time, a government that arms its citizenry is a government that trusts its people. And folks want to say that Maduro is this and Maduro is that, and well, the folks haven't turned their guns on him. So give me, as we move towards wrapping this up, give us some sense, not from the Western, Maduro is an autocrat and he's a horrible person, but what do the Venezuelans think of Nicolas Maduro?
Yeah, I think this is actually a good way to bring things home. Just a small aside before moving on to that. Okay. There's a lot of pressure going on in the Caribbean. So the Southcom Chief Admiral Halsey, he was in Antigua and Barbuda and then in Grenada. So there's a lot of pressure from the US to kind of install military assets in this country. So kind of encircling Venezuela. We mentioned the helicopters in Trinidad. And I mean, Guyana would be a subject for a different program. So it looks like up until now, Antigua has said, we have no interest in hosting U.S. military assets, and Grenada looks like it's stalling, which is a good thing. But on to Venezuela, I mean, how have these threats been seen on the ground? And on one hand, there's defiance. Obviously, there's a clear anti-imperialist tradition that. I mean, Fidel Castro said something that I think is very apt for the circumstance. He said, if there's one thing we don't like, is to be threatened. And so this is an overt threat. And over the first few weeks, the government had this kind of enlistment/signature drives for the militia, which were more of a show of support than an actual, proper military enlistment. But there have been defense exercises from the, let's call them regular armed forces and from the militia. And one thing that I would highlight is it's not just giving weapons to the people, but to the organized people, which I think makes a difference. And if you hear leaders from popular power organizations, communists above all, one of the things that's often mentioned is Vietnam and this concept of the People's War. So you are facing a technically superior enemy, but you're not going to beat him in conventional warfare, but you're thinking of a drawn-out, protracted conflict where the popular support eventually allows you to overcome this more powerful enemy. And so, in spaces where grassroots organizations are more active, you see these plans for organizing the defense of the territory, understanding the strategic points and this kind of thing, and also even from the armed forces doctrine, they're not preparing for some kind of direct engagement with the US. When they say that for the US it's going to be easy to get in, but it's going to be impossible to get out, is because they're also preparing for this kind of asymmetric combat, guerrilla tactics and so on, where they can, using the terrain and using popular support, they can neutralize or even overcome the U.S. technical military superiority. So that's why, going back to something I was saying before, it would be a strategic mistake, no matter how you look at it. I mean, of course, it's going to be a disaster in terms of civilian lives lost if the U.S. engages in a war, but even from its own strategic interests, this has the potential to be, 10 times worse than Iraq's. Of course, when we talk about the Trump administration, it's not clear that they are moved by these kind of rational calculations and scenarios, and then they choose what's most optimal for their own objectives. I mean, they might just, remember the assassination of Soleimani. That wasn't a wise move at all. Mm-hmm. So, predicting what Trump's going to do is a fool's errand. But this is the reality on the ground and something that we are witnessing here.
You just mentioned providing weapons to the organized people. Do you have any idea what the percentage of the Venezuelan population is relative to the militia? How big is the militia rough percentage relative to the population?
Yeah, again, as with all official numbers, this requires perhaps a grain of salt, but the official number is some 4.5 million people registered in the militia. So these are people who would be on the front lines confronting any kind of threat to Venezuela's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Whether there's a capacity to have them all properly armed and organized, of course, is something that's not going to be publicly disclosed. But we're talking about 4.5 million in an adult population of maybe 18 million, something like this. So wow. it is 25%. So it does show. Even if that's not the number, it gives you an idea of the order of magnitude of how a very significant chunk of the population would be willing to, from the first moment, to confront a threat to Venezuela sovereignty, to its integrity, and to its very existence as a sovereign nation.
Well, in fact, I would approach it a different way. I would suggest that, let's say your number of 4.5 million is 3 million people registered. I think there are a lot more people that aren't registered who are Chavistas and sworn to protect and defend the revolution, who would pick up arms. And I go back to General Giap's book, People's War, People's Army. And they're not registered, but they're armed.
Actually, that's a great point, because the militia is, let's say, an official initiative. It was created by Chavez, I believe, 2005, 2006. But these popular organizations, many of them actually predate the Bolivarian Revolution. They come from the 1980s and 1990s, where this kind of territorial self-organization began to take place. And being armed meant taking control of the territory, whether it was against drug trafficking, against the police, or what have you. So these organizations, many of them have remained armed. There was also a campaign for disarmament and so on, but many of them have remained armed for their own territorial self-organization, and they aren't necessarily registered with the militia, even though they would be prepared to coordinate with security and armed forces. But again, to your point, it's not just what's being officially presented. There's a longer tradition of being prepared to defend territories here.
Final point here. Aziz says, I recently saw a Kim Iverson clip about a clown that tried to invade Venezuela and was caught by fishermen. I think this is known here as the Bay of Piglets operation, and it wasn't a clown, it was a circus of clowns. What, about 10 or 12 people?
No,
Ricardo?
it was more. It was like 60 people.
Was it more? Was it? Okay, go ahead.
Because so I mean, this was. I mean, it's hilarious to look back at this. So this was for several boats that were caught on 2 days. So the boat that he's referring to, there's this very iconic picture of fishermen catching this boat that must have had 10 to 12 people. So this was a mercenary invasion that was organized during the Guaido imaginary government. Guaido actually hired these people, then he tried to say, oh, I had nothing to do with it, when it kind of blew up in his face. So they came and they thought that they would set foot on land, and then the armed forces would join them and escort them to the presidential palace, where they would arrest Maduro. And of course, the ones that made it to shore were just quickly arrested or neutralized. And it included 2 U.S. former Green Berets, who were then later sent back to the U.S. in a prisoner exchange. But the main organizer, Jordan Goudreau, who is, he had this kind of fantasies that he worked security in a concert, during the early Guaido days, and then he had this idea, why don't I organize an expedition to overthrow the government of Venezuela? And of course, these people are so deluded that they think that they're just going to waltz from the shore to the presidential palace. And in the end, it turned out to be a major embarrassment. And then it only got worse because there were reports that this guy had actually talked to officials in the first Trump administration, and they had kind of given him the green light. So kind of, if it goes well, we'll back you. If it doesn't, we never knew about it. The CIA was also aware of it. So it was just a complete embarrassment. And we hope it should be a lesson for future military adventures here in Venezuela.
Kevin Baptiste makes the point, Biden regime, which is an important point, and you mentioned Juan Guaido, because what people, I think, really need to understand here is this is not Donald Trump. We can't get caught up in Trump derangement syndrome. This is not Trump policy. This is American foreign policy. This started during the Biden administration.
Yeah, we always say that nothing is more bipartisan than imperialism. And that's the thing. I mean, we shouldn't think that the U.S. threats or the U.S. attacks against Venezuela began 6 weeks ago. I mean, they began. I mean, the economic war has been, depending on where you want to start it, but at least 8 years. And if you want to go back, you even go to the Obama administration. The Obama administration was the one that said that Venezuela is an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. National security and foreign policy, and that laid the legally, with very big air quotes, the legal basis for all the economic terrorism that followed. So we should understand, this recent escalation as another step in the overall imperialist war against Venezuela, and certainly not something that Trump invented.
Ricardo Vaz, my brother, thank you. I'm glad we've reconnected, and you will be hearing from me a lot. You will regret this day, my man. You will say, why does this guy keep calling me? Man, I greatly appreciate it, Ricardo.
No, Wilmer, the pleasure is all mine. And I hope that these threats actually subside, but I look forward to coming back and discussing anything and everything with you. It's always a pleasure.
Appreciate it. And folks, Venezuelan analysis, VenezuelanAnalysis.com is where you go to read the work of Ricardo Vaz and his associates. Great analysis. Go to VenezuelanAnalysis.com. Ricardo, greatly appreciate it. Have a good day, bro. Folks, I got to thank Ricardo for joining me today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow, and I'm hoping, and in fact, hang on, give me 1 second. Let me see if I've gotten a confirmation yet. Let me go here and see, have I gotten a confirmation from what I'm working on, and what I'm hoping here is I'm I'm hoping on Chairman Omali Yeshitela, who hopefully will join us to come on to talk about the 17th annual Black People's March on the White House. They're working on it, and hopefully they will be able to join us tomorrow. We're working on that. So with all of that, stay tuned, and I'm really hoping that they can join us tomorrow. Please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. You don't get to hear brothers like Ricardo Vaz very much, particularly at all on mainstream media. And he was able to provide, I think, some incredible on-the-ground insight and analysis to help you navigate through a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that is being provided. And remember, folks, that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a blessed remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.